Mention the Civil War to many people and they'll think of famous battles or well-known military leaders. But in Tennessee, everyone was affected by the war, for better or worse. As part of NPT's commemoration of the sesquicentennial of the Civil War, here's a piece put together by our own Ed Jones about one man's historical mission.
When I was a small child, my grandfather would take me for a ride in the country every Sunday evening. We would often pass by the entrance gate at Wessyngton, and my grandfather would point and he said, "That's Washington, that's where your grandmother's family came from."
Generations of John Baker's family had indeed spent their lives here, working the rich Robertson County soil, not because it was home, and not by choice. Washington Farm, as John refers to it, was also known as Wessyngton, the largest tobacco plantation in antebellum America. A few years later, John discovered another piece of his family puzzle in a middle school textbook.
And in that book, there was a photograph of 4 former slaves. And for some reason, I seemed to be drawn to this photograph. Shortly after we got out of school for summer vacation, the same photograph appeared in our local newspaper. My grandmother showed me the newspaper article, and she told me that the older couple were actually her grandparents, Emmanuel and Henny Washington. Her grandfather was the cook on the Washington farm. Little did I know at the time that I was actually staring at my own great-great-grandparents.
From that moment on, John was hooked. Answering his ancestors' call to tell their story quickly became an obsession for the young man.
At that time, the direct descendants of the Washington family still lived in the Wessyngton mansion, so the next day I called out there and I spoke with the 6th-generation descendant of Joseph Washington, who founded the plantation in 1796, and so my research went from there. The family had deposited all their records in the Tennessee State Library and Archives, 11,200 items, and I've gone through all these items numerous times. There was so much documentation that I actually felt that I knew many of these people personally. And then the Washington family and many of the descendants also had photographs and paintings and portraits of some of the former slaves, so that really brought it all to life. When I first started this, I simply wanted to find out more information about my great-great-grandfather and mother who had been enslaved at Wessyngton. So after that, I interviewed a number of people who were children or grandchildren of Wessyngton slaves. So I became so interested in their family stories as well, I ended up tracing not only my ancestry, but those of every family that came from Wessyngton.
The textbook photo became a 35-year journey of discovery for John and his family, culminating in this book, The Washingtons of Wessyngton Plantation. With meticulous details, John transports the reader to a period of our history that must never be forgotten nor repeated.
In 1860, there were 274 African Americans who were enslaved here at Wessyngton, and they were housed in 40 log cabins, which was about 6 persons per household, which was the largest slave population in the state of Tennessee. When I started my research, many of the original cabins were still standing, and today there's a restored cabin.
Southern planters had complete control over every aspect of a slave's life, and Wessyngton was no exception. But even under such oppression, the enslaved often found ways to repay their master.
Slaves used various ways to rebel against the system. Some of them attacked overseers, some of them ran away, some of them would ride the horses and mules at night so they would be too tired where they couldn't hardly work. Some of them broke tools to slow down the production on the plantation.
It's hard to imagine the despair that John's ancestors and millions like them had to endure. But it is said that hope springs eternal. And after years of cruelty and abuse, that glimmer of hope began to shine more brightly as storm clouds threatened our young nation.
When the war broke out, federal troops came here to Wessyngton on their first trip in September 1863. They took about 24 men and boys to work on the military fortifications, Fort Negley in Nashville, and also on the railroad. Some of those men later enlisted in the Union Army.
While the war eventually brought freedom to Wessyngton, a number of the freedmen chose to remain on the farm. For many, before and after the war, it became a final resting place.
There's a slave cemetery on the Wessyngton property, and there are approximately 200 graves there. The cemetery was started in the early 1800s, and it continued to 1928, where some of the former slaves' descendants were still buried there. Some of their descendants still remain today in Robertson County. So there are thousands of descendants that still live in the area. Every time I come here, actually, I feel a close connection to my ancestors, knowing that they were here for nearly 100 years. It's a feeling of family or connection to them.
A timeless connection, beckoning to a child across the ages, to tell a story of pain and perseverance, of hardship and hope, of freedom and family.